My name is Joseph Wright, and I am a charter member of the Dr. Arnold H. Einhorn Honor Society, and I am delighted this morning to introduce the honoree. In the interest of time, we won't go through all of Dr. Einhorn's bio. You have it there in the program. Please take a moment to read about this man's remarkable life and career. I will just highlight the fact that Dr. Einhorn joined the George Washington University School of Medicine as a professor of pediatrics and was department chair of pediatric medicine here at Children's National Medical Center beginning in 1978. And Dr. Einhorn's arrival was remarkable in that this was consistent with the rise and the growth of the program, the training program here at Children's National, into a national and highly sought after training program. Dr. Einhorn's legacy, to paraphrase the iconic William Osler, he regards all of his alumni as his legacy, and this morning I will just take a few moments to speak about his legacy and his impact on pediatrics as we honor and celebrate this remarkable man. So the Einhorn legacy, actually, I'm picking up about halfway through. Again, please take time to read about his early life, but the Einhorn legacy really embedded itself in the Bronx. And as a Brooklyn guy, I really have great respect for what Arnold was doing, very tumultuous times in the South Bronx during the time of Dr. Einhorn's training, and certainly during the 20 years that he was faculty at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. Arnold was there as chief resident right there in the middle, right? And during the 20 years that Dr. Einhorn served on the faculty of the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, his time as the training program director at the Lincoln Hospital and Medical Center proved to be a remarkable time. Before we had terms for things like the social determinants of health, before we knew what social justice meant, before we knew what health equity was all about, Arnold was doing this. Arnold was instituting programs in home visitation, mobile health, well before anybody else. And as I've learned more over the years about his time in the Bronx, I realized that what he brought to us here at Children's National was really embedded and couched in who this man was and who this man is as a humanitarian and someone who is all about the well-being of children. If you go to the Department of Pediatrics website right now at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, Arnold is listed among the luminaries, including Abraham Rudolph, who was the first Einhorn lecturer some 25 years ago, as well as many other important folks in the world of pediatrics, including Henry Barnett, and you see them listed there. The department is actually named after Louis Fraud, and Dr. Einhorn is among this group. The other remarkable part of Dr. Einhorn's legacy is during that time in the Bronx, he trained 3 presidents of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Past presidents Judith Palfrey, and my immediate predecessor as the chairman of pediatrics at the Howard University College of Medicine, Dr. Renee Jenkins, and current president, Dr. Bernard Dreyer. And just as a testament to the impact of Dr. Einhorn on these individuals, these folks have been remarkable advocates for child health, but singularly, Dr. Bernard Dreyer has focused a light on childhood poverty in this country like no one else. And again, I go back to the way that these folks were trained and who they were trained by as a testament to the impact on organized medicine and the American Academy of Pediatrics that Dr. Einhorn has had. Now, Dr. Einhorn arrived, as I mentioned, in Washington, D.C. in 1978. I was in his 5th intern class. Yours truly is there on the left side of the picture there. This is out in front of the hospital. And Dr. Einhorn personally interviewed every single applicant over a 14-year period as the residency training program director at this institution. And that is critical because this man's gift, this man's genius, in fact, is that he had the inimitable ability to bring people together in a way such that the sum of the parts is far greater than a whole. And he was able to do this, as we talked about last night at dinner, by bringing together bright people, smart people, but nice people. And this is something that, again, he was able to do and build a program over a period of time. And we all just returned, many of us just returned from the Pediatric Academic Society meetings, and many of my best friends are in this picture here, and many of us gathered last night. And this is a testament to this man's commitment to people and to continuing to be involved in all of our lives. Now, the Einhorn legacy is steeped in a tremendous impact on academic pediatrics, and this is data from Dr. Einhorn. It is so dynamic; it updates itself nearly daily. So the numbers may not be as accurate, but as we sit here today, you can see that the impact on academic pediatrics that Dr. Einhorn trainees have realized over the course of time is tremendous. But again, I go back to the fact that, like a pluripotent stem cell, Dr. Einhorn was able to build a program here at Children's National that not only has generated academic leadership, but also leadership in all domains of pediatrics. And each year that I'm able to present this recognition, it gives me pleasure to talk about the latest Einhorn disciple who was on the move again in a leadership role. This one is particularly ironic. Dr. Axiris Barbeau was one of Dr. Einhorn's last interns that he recruited to this program. She was from the South Bronx, and she has returned to New York City after serving time as a National Health Service Corps scholar here at the Unity Federally Qualified Health Center Clinic in town. She went to New York City and then became the youngest commissioner of the health department in Baltimore, and has recently been recruited back to New York by Mayor Bill de Blasio as the first deputy of Commissioner of Health for New York City. And again, I point this out because Axiris, who also happens to be a fellow alum of mine from Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School, and I share the impact of Dr. Einhorn in our lives, in our professional lives, in our personal lives. And none of us in this room goes a day. If you trained at this program, if Dr. Einhorn has touched your life, none of us goes a day without that impact touching us and impacting us every single day. So without further ado, I'd like to bring the honoree to the podium, Dr. Arnold Einhorn.
Thank you so much. I'm not so smart because I made a wrong turn this morning at 7 o'clock, and that took, and I was late. People used to say that I am usually pathologically punctual. And I thank you for your laudatory thing on my part, but what I must say that you probably exaggerate, except one thing. There's some good things I do, and one of them is bringing today somebody who is the expert extraordinaire on early childhood research, service delivery, and social policy that we bring here. He accepted so quickly to come here, and the good thing is that I didn't know he was one of my former interns and residents at Einstein. He was so special when he was an intern and resident. that I wanted to lure him and come here and give this talk. I didn't know where he was. So I said, if somebody who is such a good intern or such a good president, he must be in somewhere in Massachusetts. And you know all where they are. And I just looked there, and there he was. And I thought that he would be one professor. He mentioned it. I found out that he is 3 times. He has 3 presidencies. So I would not take more time to say that it's a wonderful, thing to have him today talk, and I will not encroach more on his time and give him the podium. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, this is a huge honor for me to be here today, and I just going to pay a particular tribute to you, Arnold. I don't need to tell people in this room about who you are or what you've accomplished, but I'm going to start. I'm going to whip through this because I really do hope we can finish with some time for some conversation. So I want to start. Basically, I would consider myself to be one of your more than 1,000 disciples who has maybe been more of a wandering pediatrician. And although I started out in academic pediatrics, I kind of left the fray and moved around, and a little bit kind of returned to that. But so a really core theme of the work that I've done, in both from an academic point of view and more important from an action agenda point of view, has really been trying to leverage this concept that is increasingly clear from a science perspective about how much early experiences affect our lifelong trajectory. So I thank you, Arnold, for our discussion last night that you allowed me to put this picture up instead of you putting it up. So here is my internship group. Arnold's always in the center in the front row. It's interesting. I think that makes a lot of sense. And kind of there I am in the back before I decided to dye my hair gray and thin it out so I get more respect. But I really do want to get onto the content of my presentation, but I have to take a minute or two to basically take a little bit of a deep dive into why your fingerprints are all over my professional life in the same way that can be said for the many more illustrious people who had the privilege of learning from you. So, so for me, my training in pediatrics, which led to an early academic career in pediatrics, but then outside of pediatrics, I always understood how being trained as a pediatrician prepares you for a lot of things other than being a clinician. I joked, in my previous job, before my current job, I was the dean of a graduate school of social policy, the Heller School at Brandeis, and had a faculty of economists and political scientists and sociologists, and realized it was a PhD program and a master's program, and I had no background in that area. And I realized pretty early on that actually the best preparation for being a dean of a graduate school is developmental behavioral pediatrics, because I mean this sincerely. So yeah, there are a lot of important academic issues to deal with, but when it comes right down to it, your daily life is dealing with sibling rivalry, temper tantrums, magical thinking, he has it, so I want it. And so I think the reason why a lot of people in academia in kind of administrative positions are not happy is because they don't like to deal with conflict, and they don't like to deal with juvenile behavior, and they don't like to deal with all of the headaches that consume most of people's time in academia when they're not out raising money. So I just really wanted to pay tribute to you, Arnold. I realize I've been thinking about this a lot, but it's always been there, if not in the front of my mind, in the middle of the mind. You taught me the importance of, within a context of a social justice agenda and a caring agenda about righting the wrongs of the world, is the importance of being very meticulous in asking questions and gathering information, and not jumping to a conclusion about what the diagnosis is, but being very thoughtful about, so what is the challenge, what is the problem, and how do we move forward, what's the right response, and then watching that response, and if it's working well, stick with it, and if it's not, think of plan B. And more than anything else, what I learned from you so well, and I think what all of us understand, is the critical importance of being able to make decisions and operate on the basis of incomplete information. Even though you always had in your head all of the information that anybody could possibly know, there was always that dimension of not really having all the answers. And I say this not just because I'm honored by your invitation to come here, but your influence early on my thinking, on the way I approach challenges in life, is very palpable and very clear, and I salute you for that. And it's not a surprise that so many people come here every year to honor that. So I thank you all for that. So now let me rush through, if I can, to tell you a little bit about kind of what my world at work is about, and to see how that's kind of part of my legacy from the Bronx in those early days. So for me, the core issue is disparities in life outcomes for children, particularly children facing poverty, violence, other threats to health and well-being. So I'm going to just very quickly go through some data that I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about, because part of the problem is we spend too much time measuring these same things over and over again and then not really knowing what to do differently. But here's the challenge. We start with the challenge in educational achievement. These are data from Sean Reardon from Stanford. So a 50-year history shows that although we still have an unacceptable gap that has to be closed, we've made significant progress on a national level in terms of reducing the racial gap on reading scores and math scores. And at the same time, the gap based on family income is increasing, and that increase started about the time that the increase in wealth and income began to become more prominent in this country. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of reducing disparities in preparation for school and completion of enough schooling to be able to get a job to survive in a global economy. We are not only are we not making progress, we're losing ground, and that is clearly a part of what pediatricians need to be concerned about. It's why, although still we do a pathetically poor job of whatever it is, a month or two in 3 years to teach pediatricians about development. And we go out and we screen early on for developmental milestones, but it's so much more than that. This is a real problem threatening children's well-being. The problem of racial disparities in health outcomes is huge. I don't have to tell this audience about it, but the problem is not just that it exists, but that we're not making any progress in narrowing those gaps. I'll just pick one example: infant mortality. This is a 25-year history of infant mortality rates in the United States by race and ethnic group: Asian and Pacific Islander, white non-Hispanic, Hispanic, Native American, and African American. The rate in infant mortality rates have been coming down. The gap by race hasn't gotten smaller. The infant mortality rate for babies born to African American women today is higher than it was for whites 25 years ago. It's just unacceptable. And the answer, I think all of you know this, but we continue this myth. The answer is not prenatal care. Okay? It's not just prenatal care. It's more than that. So what's the evidence base of what we do? And now I'm going to basically tee up. I'm not going to keep you in suspense. My take-home message that we're going to build to for the rest of this presentation is that pediatrics has to step to the plate and go beyond. I salute my good friend Bernard Dreyer, who was part of my legacy of that group in Jacoby. Bernard was 1 year ahead of me, was my chief resident when I was a PL3. I salute the focus on poverty, but focusing on poverty and saying we have to do something about it doesn't turn that around. The question is, what are we going to do? And the major take-home message for me here is we have to start thinking about what we're going to do differently in pediatrics, as opposed to how can we do what we do a little bit better and how can we get everybody else to do it. So here are data from a meta-analytic database that we have built over the last several years. This is just one piece of this. I'm going to show you out of the thousands of studies that have been published for center-based early care and education programs in the last 50 years, beginning with Great Society programs. This is what the data look like in terms of impact at the time of program completion on cognitive development and kind of at school entry, like reading readiness and math readiness scores. So it looks like this. The zero line means no effect. So the first message here is we have shown over and over again for almost a half a century that we can change trajectories and we can improve outcomes and improve readiness to succeed in school by well-designed and well-implemented studies and then turned into programs. The size of the bubbles is an indication of the relative sample size. So there's very little below the line or at the line, so we don't have to keep asking the question of whether programs make a difference. But what we have to notice is that the trend line in terms of the magnitude of the impacts is pretty flat. Now you would look at this and say it's actually not flat, it's dipping down. The reason for that, most people assume, is the fact that the counterfactual has changed. In the 60s and the 70s, if you did a randomized control trial, a treatment group didn't get anything because there wasn't much around. Now, if you're in a study of an early childhood program, there are so many programs all around that if you're in the treatment group, if you're in the control group, your family usually finds something else. And so the estimates of impact are probably relatively modest. But let's be generous and say it's flat. So for 50 years, we've shown over and over again we can make a difference, but on average this is about 0.2 effect size, so kids are coming into school from programs with a 2-month advantage over the kids who weren't in school. That's statistically significant, but it's of a magnitude that nobody should be popping the champagne on. So, I mean, could we do better? So, I'm not equating poverty with ALL. But there's a reason to put this up because it has some important messages for what we might be doing differently. So here's the story of the 5-year survival rate of acute lymphocytic leukemia. Beginning in 1964, the summer before the first Head Start program was established, the 5-year survival rate was about 3%. 10 years later, this 5-year survival rate was 60%. 2006, it was 95%. It's a little bit higher now. Compare this to the 50-year curve for how we're doing on early childhood and education programs. Now, again, I don't want to overstate the case. These are two very different issues. The ability to measure whether you live or die is a lot easier than measure whether you're prepared to do well in school. But there are some critical messages here that we as pediatricians, if we're going to play in the early childhood policy world, and we're going to acknowledge that this is an important part of healthy development. We have messages to teach the rest of the field, the policy arena, and all the people who think about how to spend money. This didn't happen by magic. Okay? This happened from most of the people in the field at any point in time providing state-of-the-art care, whatever it was. While everyone depended upon a group in the back room that represented the R&D dimension of the field that was relentlessly pursuing a deeper understanding of the disease, of its causal mechanisms, its pathophysiology, and using that to devise new treatments, some of which, when they were tested, made kids sicker and made them die sooner, some of which made marginal impacts, but when you put two together, it actually had a synergistic effect larger than either one alone. For those of you who are experts in this field, I apologize for my simplistic presentation here, but it's the point that I'm trying to make. So if leukemia treatment had operated the way early childhood works, when it went from 5% to 60% survival in 10 years, it would have celebrated and stopped, said, look at how much progress we've made, but no, that wasn't good enough. People kept pushing and pushing, and now, today, when the diagnosis is made, it's not just a matter of giving the treatment, it's a matter of subtyping based on data you can gather at the beginning and find out which treatment is likely to be most effective for which subgroup, and then still people are focusing on improving survival to get to 100% and making the treatment less toxic. You get the message. There's a relentless pursuit of deeper scientific understanding to get to the kind of impacts that everyone would want for his or her own child. No parent would say, I'm happy that the treatment is now more effective than it was 10 years ago, but I'm sorry my child is dying, or I'm sorry my child is ill-prepared to school, or that my child has diabetes, or has other the precursors of chronic illness that he was not born destined to have, and that is a result of life experience. So this is the Different Einstein. This is the one who named himself after the medical center in the Bronx. Albert Einstein, so many quotes are attributed to Albert Einstein, sometimes you wonder whether he really said it, but I'm sure he said something like this. And this is the message to all of us about early childhood policy and practice, including in the medical home. If we always do what you always did, you will always get what you always got. I will tell you, the first paper I ever had published was a study that Paul Dworkin and I did in 5 New England states. We went around and visited 97 pediatricians in their offices to find out how they screened for developmental problems early in the first 3 to 5 years of life. And it was not the first study, but it was one of the early studies of what actually happens in pediatric practice. And we wrote 2 papers, one about the implication. Well, what we found was that people weren't doing a very systematic job at this, and there were 2 papers. One talked about the implications for how we do things differently in practice, and the other talked about implications for medical training. So fast forward, this was a while ago. This was kind of maybe, several decades ago. And I just checked. The latest thing is that nationally, somewhere between 40 and 50% of pediatricians do any kind of systematic screening in the first 3 years of life in their offices, and that's just unacceptable. But if the goal is to get everybody to screen, then the challenge becomes, what do you do? And unfortunately, I'm being intentionally provocative here because I owe it to Arnold, who really, I didn't realize it at the time, but was my inspiration for constructive dissatisfaction with wherever we are. That whatever we're doing, as good as it can be, it can always be better. And quite frankly, I think the crisis, and if we're going to take seriously Bernard Dreyer's call to deal with poverty, early identification and referral to a program that maybe will have an impact is just not the answer. Who would refer a child with a heart problem to a cardiologist who maybe knows what to do and maybe doesn't, right? I mean, that's the analogy. So I'm going to show you, this is one of 2 videos I'm going to show. The reason I'm showing this, and most of it is stuff you know, but I want to show this as an example of how we are trying to make complex science understandable to non-scientists who make decisions about reallocation of resources and to make decisions about programs. So this is the 1 minute and 25-second summary of 21st century neuroscience about what we know about how experience shapes the architecture of the brain.
A child's experiences during the earliest years of life have a lasting impact on the architecture of the developing brain. Genes provide the basic blueprint, but experiences shape the process that determines whether a child's brain will provide a strong or weak foundation for all future learning, behavior, and health. During this important period of brain development, billions of brain cells called neurons send electrical signals to communicate with each other. These connections form circuits that become the basic foundation of brain architecture. Circuits and connections proliferate at a rapid pace and are reinforced through repeated use. Our experiences and environment dictate which circuits and connections get more use. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent. Meanwhile, connections that are used less fade away through a normal process called pruning. Well-used circuits create lightning-fast pathways for neural signals to travel across regions of the brain. Simple circuits form first, providing a foundation for more complex circuits to build on later. Through this process, neurons form strong circuits and connections for emotions, motor skills, behavioral control, logic, language, and memory during the early critical period of development. With repeated use, these circuits become more efficient and connect to other areas of the brain more rapidly. While they originate in specific areas of the brain, the circuits are interconnected. You can't have one type of skill without the others to support it. Like building a house, everything is connected, and what comes first forms a foundation for all that comes later.
So this is the kind of popular translation of the legacy of the Human Genome Project and the explosion in neurobiology and molecular biology and epigenetics, and the basic message that this old nature versus nurture debate is a kind of an interesting 20th century kind of a meaningful scientific question, and that you can't separate the two. And all of the things we care about, whether they be learning or behavioral adaptation or mental health or physical health, none of them is hardwired at birth. by kind of genetic predetermination. All of this is literally right down to the methyl groups that are attached to the epigenome affects how genes are expressed and affects these outcomes. So, and that video, by the way, took over a year to produce because we had a very kind of harsh scientific peer review of the scientific accuracy of it. So it's not an advocacy puff piece. It's hard science presented in ways that most reasonably educated people can understand who don't know anything about science. So now to shift, and let's keep the focus back on Arnold's legacy, on the legacy of those of us who worked in the South Bronx in those days, and the work that all of you do here today in D.C. What is the impact of adversity on the health and well-being of children, and how can we, as the custodians of bringing science to the table, along with a kind of a caring practice context, how can we do better? What could we do differently? So, for starters, these are data taken from a national study done by Rick Barth at the University of Maryland, looking at about 1,100 children nationally in the child welfare system at the age of 3. And the question was, all of these children were in active cases for abuse and neglect. The question was, what is the impact of additional risk factors in their lives above and beyond abuse and neglect on, in this case, a standardized developmental test at age 3? And what you get from here is the ubiquitous pattern of everything you ever study related to development, behavior, physical health, mental health. It always comes out with the same pattern. That 1 or 2 risk factors doesn't do you in. As the number of risk factors increases, you're at greater risk. And in this case, by the time you got to 6 or 7 risk factors, this was neglect or abuse plus low parent education, maternal depression, low family income, the usual risk factors. 90 to 100% of all of the children who had this many risk factors in their lives were failing the developmental test at age 3. This wasn't just their emotional and social development, it was their cognition, their language development, basically on their way to failing in school and having all of the problems in life that go with that. And to go to the other side of the world, Dunedin, New Zealand. Some of you may be familiar with kind of a fairly well-known in the epidemiologic world, a birth cohort study in a small, middle-sized city in New Zealand, in Dunedin. About 40 years ago, every pregnant woman in the city was approached to participate in a study. They got very high uptake and have had amazing retention of this sample over almost a 40-year period right now. That's what happens when you're a little island nation out in the Pacific Ocean and not a lot of people moving in and out. So anyway, these are data taken at age 32 years. So these 32-year-olds who have followed since they were in utero, all with prospectively collected data. And in this case, I'm showing you the results of measuring C-reactive protein. I don't have to tell you about C-reactive protein, but for this purpose, we think of it as an indicator of somewhat increased risk for heart disease. It's not doesn't mean you have heart disease, but somewhat greater risk. So of the over 1,000 individuals who were assayed, a little over 15% had elevated C-reactive proteins. Probably these were healthy adults and probably reflecting some genetic variant. About 25% of those with a diagnosis of depression had elevated C-reactive protein. This confirmed many previous studies and has since been replicated. There is an elevated inflammatory dimension to depression as a diagnosis that's kind of well known, that you find this marker in people with depression. What was not well known before, this was one of the first studies to show it, it's been replicated many times since. 32-year-olds who had a documented history of having been maltreated as a child had elevated C-reactive proteins at a level of about 1 in 3. And 32-year-olds who had both a history of documented maltreatment and clinical depression, 40%, almost 40% had elevated C-reactive protein. A scientist looks at that and says, well, it's one study. If you look at a growing knowledge base and you begin to kind of think about, so what is it about adversity that leads to discrepancies in disease, we're beginning to open up the black box of what is it about adversity that gets inside the body, into the brain, into the cardiovascular system, into the immune system, and explains why we see these outcomes. They're not ordained from conception. So this leads to a second video. It's equally short. This is the video that explains the concept of what we coined the term 10 years ago, toxic stress, and what toxic stress means.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
So I'm going to make my pitch. We're here at one of the most distinguished academic medical centers in the country, if not the world. There is a revolution going on in biology right now. A lot of that is reflected in a lot of the work that's done at an institution like this in many disciplines. Immunology is a very hot area of research right now, neuroscience. Primary care pediatrics and the general care of children needs to start to learn more about this science and think about what we might do differently than just giving advice and screening and making referrals to programs that we hope will do good. This is a tremendously missing and underdeveloped part of the science of academic pediatrics and clinical pediatrics. Julius Richmond, whose named chair I have the honor of having, who was the founding director of Head Start, wrote a paper in the 1960s and he called child development the basic science of pediatrics. Neurobiology and the biology of adversity is the basic science of pediatrics right now if we care about children living in poverty, and we just can't ignore that. And so it's academic medical centers that need to start to think about, so how do the primary care docs and the developmental behavioral people interact with the scientists in immunology and the scientists in infectious disease and the scientists in a variety of other, in metabolic disorders, to think about what's the common thread about understanding what is happening to the health of children early in life. So this is the summary. I'm going to move now from the science to, so what do we do about it and what are the new ideas? The take-home message here is that early experiences are literally embedded biologically in our bodies, for better or worse, actually beginning prenatally, and that stable, supportive relationships, language-rich environments, mutually responsive serve-and-return interactions with adults literally promote healthy brain architecture. The brain is expecting that to make its circuits. That affects the regulation of a lot of metabolic and basic biological systems that are influenced by the relative predictability and regularity as opposed to chaos of daily life. And these are the building blocks of resilience. Everybody likes to talk about resilience these days. Resilience is neither something you're born with nor something you suck up and summon yourself with grit and say, okay, I'm going to overcome this. You don't do it by yourself. These are built on capabilities that develop over time, and they don't come in on automatic pilot. The flip side of this is excessive or prolonged activation of the stress response systems leads to persistent elevations in heart rate, blood pressure, serum glucose, stress hormones, with cortisol being the most well-studied, pro-inflammatory cytokines. All of these things, which are what explains the feeling of being stressed out, have a wear and tear effect on the body. They were meant to occur acutely to deal with acute threat. They were not meant, from an evolutionary point of view, to be activated all the time. And so excessive inflammation has something to do with the fact that it's an inflammatory component to cardiovascular disease and atherosclerosis. Maybe that's beginning to help us understand why we see more heart disease associated. So, persistent glucose elevation and producing insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome and diabetes type 1, maybe that's why this is not equally distributed across the population. There's so much to learn and so much to apply that who's going to do this if not pediatrics? And that's not just the people in the clinics, it's the people in the laboratories and the people in the subspecialty services who are doing a deeper dive into understanding pathophysiology. So I'm going to quickly run through now. Everything I've presented up until now is basically state-of-the-art scientific knowledge, all backed up by good evidence. The rest of the presentation is sharing with you how we are thinking right now about what to do with this new knowledge. I don't have proof for any of this. We don't have all the answers, but we're not going to do the same old stuff, hoping for a different outcome. And this is how we're using it to think. And I would invite all of you to start thinking about how, particularly if you're involved in dealing with social determinants of health and delivery of health services, of how we might modify some of the things we do. So this is 21st century science, maybe thinking differently about early childhood intervention. For starters, early experiences affect lifelong learning, lifelong health, not just learning. This is not just about school readiness. This is about the early roots of the major chronic diseases of adulthood that are the big budget busters. This is about early prevention or amelioration of the risk factors for heart disease, hypertension, diabetes, stroke, the list goes on and on. Second, healthy development requires protection of the developing brain and other organ systems, not just provision of enriched learning experiences. So maybe hypothesis, everything I'm going to say now is hypothesis, okay? Maybe the reason why some of the good quality early care and education programs are not affecting the development of some children is because they have the experience of toxic stress and its physiological disruptions may be affecting their ability to focus attention and to be able to kind of follow instructions and control their impulses. That is not a matter of a bad attitude, but a matter of how well those capacities are wired and function. And this is not a heavy biological determinism doomsday scenario. It's saying the brain retains a lot of plasticity, but it decreases over time. It's just easier to get it right the first time. This is the big one, and this is, I think, I don't have any proven answers yet, but this is what my gut tells me has to be the revolution in primary care pediatrics, is that what do we do from the beginning in primary care pediatrics? We see children, we talk to their parents, you know, we go through the usual exam and screenings for vision and hearing, and we have what we call anticipatory guidance, or we provide information and support the parents. We encourage them to talk to their kids, to read to their kids, give them advice on sleep problems, which in many cases is fine and it's enough. But for families whose lives are in chaos and are barely getting by from day to day, I'm going to predict that an area we should be looking deeper at is whether primary care should be, if we want much better outcomes for children, particularly children facing adversity, then we have to start to figure out how we can support the adults who care for them to change their own lives. That doesn't mean that we're taught on how you get a job and how you kind of develop the skills you need to be a successful adult, but if we don't figure out how to connect with people who can do that better, the chances of us changing outcomes for children are limited because children's development is influenced by the environment of relationships in which they live. It's not just their parents, it's the low-paid, poorly trained people in child care centers who have hearts of gold and are given 15 kind of not very well-regulated 18-month-olds to take care of every day and told, you know, read to them and talk to them. So we have to get serious about this. This is kind of like a different environmental context. If there was a neurotoxin in the water, we'd mobilize ourselves, unless you live in Michigan, right? But this is no different. This is about how the elements of the environment influence developing organs and the development of competence and the development of health. So there's a missing niche in the pediatric world, particularly in primary care, that must start to be addressed. There's no shame in the fact that we don't know what to do better than what we're doing now. No shame at all. But it's hard to explain why we would just shrug our shoulders and say, well, we'll just keep churning out this same model. We need to figure this out, and we need, now, not everybody can do that. So if you look at a field, this is taken from Everett Rogers' work about how innovation diffuses in any field. So our field is no different from any other field. We have some part of the field that's really struggling with basic quality issues, people who just aren't even doing basic screening in a practice, or wish that people just didn't bring in the problems that they have. In all fairness, I'm not demonizing people. We're not trained to do this. There's nothing worse than having a problem presented to you. I think back to my days as a resident. The worst is when there's a problem and you have no clue as to what to do, but everybody knows how horrible that feels. But there's a part of the field that isn't even building in the kind of basics of what we know, and we know there are economic reasons for that. There are regulatory problems. It's a mess out there. I don't have an answer for this, but there's still a large part of the field that's basically meeting standards and doing screening and identifying problems and on good faith making referrals and providing information to parents and encouraging them to do the kinds of things that are helpful for children. There's another part of the field that's delivering state-of-the-art. That is at the vanguard of new ideas to incorporate not just in what a pediatrician does in an office, but what a primary health care setting could provide with a team of other people, or be well integrated in a coordinated and collegial way with others in the community that can provide what you can provide. We can't treat maternal depression in a pediatric office, but maternal depression is a huge threat to early childhood development. It's those kinds of things. We can't get jobs for people, but if you don't know if there's going to be food on the table the next day, that creates an environment that is not conducive to good health. So this is kind of what the field looks like, and here, what's missing is the R&D dimension. The people who are generating and testing new ideas across sectors, who are allowed to try things and fail, because all of the big breakthroughs come from trying and failing and learning from things that don't work. And then there are the people who are the early adopters who will say, when something looks promising, I want to be the first one to try this in my practice. If we take Silicon Valley as a model, or any place else where breakthroughs happen, they all tell you, this is the badge of honor. They will tell you about all of the things they tried that failed before they hit it. It never happens the first time. And our field is unforgiving. You do something, you have to not find out whether it works. You have to present data that proves that it makes a difference, so you'll get the next grant. And so everybody who survives knows how to write a progress report showing good things that are happening, and we bury. We don't put out there in a bright light the things we tried that don't work, and so we're missing the essence of how innovation works, which is see failure as a learning opportunity as opposed to hope the funders don't find out. And none of these problems will be solved in a 3-year demonstration project grant. I'll give you the grant to solve this in 3 years. And don't ask me for more money, because what have you accomplished in the last 3 years? In the innovation world, people say the only failure is the failure to learn. I would say, even just from a screening point of view, what have we learned from the last 50 years of making minimal progress in why people are not doing even more basic screening? Okay, and the answer can't just be a shrug and say, well, you know, it's hard because we don't have enough time and we don't get reimbursed for it anyway. And I don't mean to be snide about this, and believe me, I'm with you on the inside rather than poking from the outside, but it's like we're not, the data, the demographic and the population level data say we're not making enough progress on reducing these disparities. So here's just a little snippet of what advances in science are right out there in the other part of our world, in the parts of the medical school where the laboratories are, that basically are waiting to be used by people who want to figure out clinical application. There's research on neuroplasticity and critical periods in development now that will knock your socks off, about understanding at a deeper level what the different critical periods may be for different aspects of brain development. That could help us be much better than saying, well, early's better than later. There are some things for which early may be critically important and not for other things, and it's sitting there waiting. And by the way, there's some really interesting work showing that what we used to think were irrevocable critical periods may be openable again. Even something like amblyopia. There's some really fascinating work going on. The fact that amblyopia is not related to a structural change in the ocular columns that they're actually related to molecular breaks that make it difficult to reopen those circuits, but theoretically could be reopened. That's what 21st century science has the opportunity to put on the table. Gene-environment interaction, epigenetics, a deeper understanding of why in the same environment do some kids do better than others, why in the same program do some children do well and some children not. In infectious disease, we wouldn't tolerate, you have an infection, okay, we'll give you an antibiotic. We ask, like, which infection? Match it to the right antibiotic, and then we have this interesting phenomenon. We have an antibiotic that works 80% of the time. but for 20% of the kids, it's not working, or there's a resistance developed to it. We don't say, well, on average, it works better. We say, no, for some part of the population, we need something else. Science is sitting there waiting to help us dig deeper into looking at these differences in vulnerability and resilience. And right on the horizon, it's not that far away, we have a very exciting research network that I'm a part of that's working on developing biological and biobehavioral measures of toxic stress that could be used in a clinical setting. To basically say, not every child in poverty is experiencing toxic stress. Not every child in a home where there's mental illness is experiencing toxic stress. How do we identify who is showing physiological disruptions, and how do we measure whether what we're doing is making a difference, is restoring physiological homeostasis, and how do we do that in a way that's owned by parents and the community? Because when you start bringing biology to the setting, it's a really ugly history of the misuse of biology, particularly for communities of color. People shouldn't trust it, shouldn't assume that it's going to be anything but harmful, but if done appropriately and co-owned by community leaders and parents, it's a way to start to think differently about what to do about the fact that people in communities of color are dying from heart disease in their 40s. It's just not acceptable to shrug our shoulders and say, well, it's a complicated social and economic problem. So just, again, I'm going to just go through this really quickly. I know we're barely 5 minutes left. Here's an example of some of the things I'm talking about. Work done on development of fear circuitry in the brain. It happens very early in life. This is taken from rodent studies. A lot of what we know in neurobiology comes from animal studies, but so I've been told by the neurobiologists, there's much more that's similar about how human brains develop than there is different, except human brains are very different than the prefrontal cortex. Kind of trumps what everybody else has, all the other animals have. But circuits that run from the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex that have to do with the detection and response to fear. There's a kind of a well-known cycle of optimal plasticity in which those circuits are developed based on age. It happens pretty early in life. There's some very compelling animal studies that show in the presence of maternal separation very early in life, it shifts the curve and the critical periods open earlier and close earlier, suggesting that timing may really matter for some things, and just kind of saying, well, you know, we'll get around to this before you start school. There may be things where it really matters about what happens in the first 6 months without overstating it. It doesn't mean it's too late if you come in later, but it means you're now trying to undo something that you could have prevented in the first time. And what is more essential to what pediatrics is all about than a prevention mentality, right? How can we prevent it rather than how can we fix it? This is a particularly important one, the development of executive function and self-regulation skills, which is the ability to engage in goal-directed behavior and to focus your attention and control your impulses and plan and act and then reset and move to option B because plan A isn't working, and cognitive flexibility to understand rule changes and to be able to adapt to that. These skills have the longest trajectory of development. They begin in infancy with differential attention. And again, there's good science for this, and also common sense will tell you a child in a well-regulated, fairly predictable, responsive environment is able to develop early attentional focus much faster than a child who lives in a chaotic and unpredictable and unstable environment where it's really hard to know what's happening next. But the thing about the plasticity curve for the executive function skills is the steepest slope is in the period from age 3 to 5. And these are not skills that come in on automatic pilot. They are scaffolded by adults who have well-regulated executive function skills. This is the difference. There's science, and your grandmother could tell you the difference between a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old. A 5-year-old can sit still longer and focus better and follow instructions better and control impulses better, and those are the things you need to be successful in school. But it's adults who scaffold those skills in children. So Mother Nature, again, it's always giving us, this is this kind of another period of accelerated development. Age 15 to 25 years, that's where the more mature prefrontal cortex skills come in. Program. So these are sensitive periods are periods of optimal plasticity, optimal responsiveness to the environment. Look at this period from age 15 to 25. A lot of parents in that age in high-risk environments. These skills develop with coaching and with practice. They don't develop by being told to do that. And so what are we doing? We're giving advice. and we're giving information at a time when there's plasticity in those parts of the brain that will do well with intensive coaching and mentoring and practice. And the beauty of that is that coaching and practice is not pejorative. Elite athletes have coaches and they practice all the time. And CEOs hire very high-priced coaches to tell them how to behave and interact with people. So there's nothing demeaning about coaching and practice. But the biology tells us it's not going to happen if you give out cheat sheets or advice in a kind of 15-second discussion about what to do if your life is in chaos. The social class gradients related to anything you want to look at are always clear. These are data taken from a Canadian population study looking at vocabulary related to social class. But the important message in this is not the social class gradient, it's the huge spread. Look at the variability at every point in the social class continuum. So this is not just a dichotomous, poor people have problems, people who have more money don't. And so individual differences in variability is the name of the game. And that's what pediatrics is all about. We don't just do something, we say, because this is what the data show. If it's not working for a particular child, we have to go back to the drawing board. We have to get more information. We have to be more ingenious. We shouldn't just be shooting in the dark. There's science waiting to help us think. So the last thing I want to say is the issue of how we evaluate what we do. This also has to change. This is how a half a century of early childhood policy and practice has been evaluated. We do an intervention. We do it in a well-controlled, randomized experiment. And we have all of these data points about how people respond. And we look at the mean effect of the intervention. And if it's above 0 and it reaches statistical significance, we call it an evidence-based program. And we say, okay, go do it. But what we really should be doing is asking, why did it work so well for these children and families? Why did it work so poorly for these children and families? If we can figure out where it's working, we could scale that program already for groups of children and families for whom it's going to make a big impact. And we go back to the drawing board for the ones who aren't being helped and figure out what can we do differently. The people who don't benefit programs are disproportionately in the attrition groups when we do a study. They are the families who we identify as resistant families who are kind of not coming, or they come but they stop coming. Maybe it's because this isn't doing them any good. We will never find that out if we just look at mean differences between treatments and controls. This is the oppression of the RCT that isn't, this is not an anti-RCT statement. It has to come at the end after we figured out what's working for whom. We wouldn't do this with cancer. We wouldn't say what's the average best treatment for cancer. We'd say which kind, which is working for whom. So this is my take-home message for you. Pediatric practice has to be grounded in a deeper understanding of the underlying science of early development and lifelong health. We need to do a deeper dive into causal mechanisms. We need to have a deeper understanding of pathophysiology, because that's where the ideas come from for what we would do differently. And that's where the ideas come from of how we can gauge whether we're doing better or not and matching what we're doing to the results we're getting. So I love this cartoon. I wish I knew who did it because I found it a long time ago. But this notion about needing to be more explicit here in step 2, it's not about screening, referral, and wondering what's happening. It's like, so what's happening in that referral? It's not about initiating a program and seeing what you get at the under end. It's like, why are we doing this program? What do we think it's focused on? What do we think it's accomplished? And it's not about measuring everything you can think of at the end, hoping something will come out statistically significant so you can be labeled an evidence-based program, but say, so what's the point? Because when we replicate or we try to scale, you always have to adapt it to a different context. And if you don't understand the underlying causal mechanisms, you can't adapt it. This is our website. Many of you probably are not aware of our website. If you're interested, we have a lot of material on there that translates this science into language that non-scientists can understand. We also have a major report that's being launched on our website this afternoon that summarizes with much more detail all of the stuff I've talked with you about this morning. So I'm sorry we ran a little bit over. I want to end where I began. And thank you, Arnold, personally, and those of you here at the Medical Center for truly honoring me with the opportunity to come and share my work as a testimonial to the influence you've had on my career, Arnold. So thank you. Here's